The air in the queen's lodgings, usually thick with the scent of rosewater and imported silks, now hung heavy with the metallic tang of fear and the cloying dampness of stone. Anne, Queen of England, but for how much longer, sat by a narrow, grated window. Her once vibrant crimson gown, a garment chosen in a foolish, defiant echo of past triumphs, felt like a shroud. The Tower of London, a place of regal power and brutal demise, breathed its cold, ancient breath upon her, chilling her to the marrow far more effectively than any spring draft. Outside, the world moved on, indifferent to the woman whose fate hung by a thread thinner than a spider's silk. She could hear the distant, muffled cries of gulls from the Thames, a sound that in earlier, freer days had signified London's bustling life, but now merely mocked her confinement with its promise of flight. Her ladies, those few remaining who had not fled like rats from a sinking ship, hovered in the corners, shadows cast by the meager light filtering through the fortified glass. They whispered, their voices like rustling dry leaves, words undoubtedly of pity, fear, or perhaps condemnation. Anne did not turn. Her gaze remained fixed on the sliver of sky, a bruised purple at the horizon, hinting at the storm brewing, both without and within the walls that now held her captive. How many nights had she slept in this very bed, surrounded by these very walls, oblivious to the despair they held for others? The irony was a bitter draught burning her throat. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant clang of a guard's armor, every shift in the wind against the ancient stone was a torment, a phantom step drawing closer, bringing the inevitable. Her mind, usually a whirl of sharp wit and keen intellect, felt dulled, bogged down by the sludge of despair. Yet flashes of memory like shards of broken glass pierced through the gloom. The king's eyes, once alight with an obsessive, burning adoration that had elevated her, now held a cold, terrifying emptiness. The promises, the whispered vows beneath tapestries heavy with royal crests, the secret meetings, the daring defiance of Rome, all had dissolved like mist. He had called her his own dear darling, had carved her initials into trees, had torn an entire kingdom asunder for her sake. And now, she was an obstacle, a barren branch, a witch in his fevered imagination, cursed to give him no living son. The thought made a hollow laugh escape her lips, a dry, rasping sound that startled her ladies. Lady Worcester, whose loyalty was born more of familial obligation than genuine affection, shifted nervously, her hands twisting the fine linen of her apron. "Your Grace," she began, her voice a reedy tremor, "Master Kingston, the constable, requests an audience." Anne's spine stiffened, a flicker of her old imperiousness returning. "Tell him I am indisposed." The words were an attempt at dignity, a desperate grasp at the tatters of her former power. Lady Worcester wrung her hands. "He insists, Your Grace. He says it is urgent." The unspoken threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Kingston only insisted when the king's will was behind him. A wave of nausea swept over Anne. Urgent, always urgent, when they sought to strip another layer of her existence away. She had endured the accusations, the trumped-up charges of incest, with her own brother, of adultery with musicians and courtiers, of witchcraft, all monstrous lies woven by a spider's hand, a hand she knew all too well. Cromwell, the king's sharp-toothed minister, once her ally, now her most fervent destroyer. He had orchestrated this grand, macabre play, the final act drawing near. She had misjudged him, had trusted in his pragmatism, believing he would see the folly of her destruction. Fool. Every viper had its own nest. She rose, her movements stiff, as if her limbs were made of lead. The gown, once a symbol of her queenship, now felt like an iron cage. Her reflection in the polished surface of a distant chest showed a gaunt face, eyes too large, ringed with shadows. The dark, expressive eyes that had captivated a king now held only a desperate, haunted plea. Her famous, long, dark hair, usually meticulously pinned and adorned, hung loose, a disheveled cascade over her shoulders, mirroring the chaos within her soul. The single pearl necklace, a gift from the king in happier times, felt like a noose, cold against her skin. "Very well," she said, her voice a hollow whisper, startling herself with its weakness. "Let him enter." The heavy oak door groaned open, revealing Master Kingston. His face, usually a mask of stern formality, was etched with something akin to pity, or perhaps simply weariness. He was a man accustomed to seeing great men and women fall, their power evaporating like dew in the morning sun. He carried a parchment scroll, its edges crisp and new, and the sight of it sent a fresh jolt of fear through Anne. Official documents always brought ill tidings. "Your Grace," Kingston began, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, "I regret to inform you of the court's decision regarding the matter." He paused, his gaze briefly meeting hers, then falling away. He seemed to shrink under the weight of his duty, or perhaps the enormity of her impending doom. Anne clutched her hands together, her knuckles white. "Speak, Master Kingston. Have done with it. What new calumny have they fabricated for my demise?" Her voice, though trembling, held a brittle edge of defiance. She would not beg, not for these vultures. Kingston cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. "The court, after due consideration of the evidence presented, has found you guilty of high treason, all charges." The words struck her like physical blows, though she had known them, had expected them. Still, the finality of it, spoken aloud in the chill air of her prison, was a fresh agony. Guilty, all charges, incest, adultery, witchcraft. The accusations were so grotesque, so unthinkable, that their very utterance felt like a desecration. Her own brother George had been dragged into this charade, condemned alongside her, his life snuffed out just days before, a prelude to her own grand finale. The thought of George, strong, vibrant, loving, broken by this injustice, brought a hot, blinding surge of grief and rage. "And the sentence?" Anne asked, her voice surprisingly steady, a desperate calm descending upon her. She knew what it would be. There was only one sentence for high treason. Kingston hesitated, his gaze fixed on the parchment in his hands, as if the words themselves might scorch his eyes. "You are to be beheaded." He said the last word in a rush, as if to rip the Band-Aid off quickly. "On Tower Hill." A sharp, incredulous laugh escaped Anne's lips, louder this time, echoing off the stone walls. "Tower Hill," she repeated, the sound thin and brittle. "Not within the privacy of the Tower Green, as befits a queen?" Her mind raced. Public execution. A spectacle. This was not merely punishment. It was a degradation, a warning, a final, brutal humiliation. They sought to erase her, not just from the throne, but from the memory of men, branding her as a common criminal, a Jezebel. Kingston shook his head, his face a mask of sorrow, or perhaps distaste. "The king's mercy, Your Grace, has seen fit to grant you a less painful death. By sword, not axe. Less painful." The words tasted like ashes in her mouth. A sword, an axe. What difference did it make when the end was the same? Her breath hitched. But the location, Tower Hill, to be put on display, to satisfy the bloodlust of the masses, to become a cautionary tale whispered in taverns. This was the final exquisite cruelty. Her private suffering would become public theater. The thought made her stomach churn. "When?" she demanded, her voice regaining some of its former steel, though it was a shaky, desperate kind of strength. Kingston finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers, full of something she could not quite decipher. Perhaps regret, perhaps simply the cold resignation of a man delivering a death warrant. "The morrow, Your Grace. At dawn. The morrow. Dawn." The words resonated in the cold chamber, an anvil striking an empty bell. A single agonizing day separated her from oblivion. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The muted light from the window faded, replaced by the encroaching shadows of evening, long spectral fingers stretching across the room, reaching for her. She was a moth, caught in a giant's cruel hand, her wings already torn, the flame drawing closer. The air grew impossibly thin, the scent of fear now almost suffocating. Her ladies gasped, some openly weeping, their distress a dull echo of the maelstrom within Anne. Tomorrow. The very word was a death knell. She closed her eyes, picturing the block, the glint of steel, the baying crowd. And then, the utter consuming darkness. Kingston cleared his throat again. "There is one other matter, Your Grace. The executioner has arrived, from Calais." He hesitated, then added, almost as an afterthought, "He is said to be skilled." The implication was clear, swift, clean, precise. A cold comfort. Anne opened, her eyes, their gaze fixed on Kingston, but seeing beyond him, to the figure that awaited her. From Calais, French. They would bring a foreigner to sever the head of an English queen. Another calculated insult, another layer of humiliation. But then a sudden chilling thought pierced through her despair, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. If he was from Calais, a place where the king still held sway, a place under English rule, what if this supposed mercy was yet another deception? What if the sword, instead of being a swift end, was merely a tool for a more prolonged, agonizing spectacle? What if this skilled executioner was not meant to be quick, but to ensure the agony was visible, protracted, a final public lesson in the wages of perceived sin? Her blood ran cold. The hour after Kingston's departure felt like a lifetime stretched across a rack. The silence in the Queen's lodgings was not empty, but thick with the weight of unshed tears, unvoiced prayers, and the chilling certainty of dawn. Anne, left alone, with her ladies, moved as if in a trance. The initial shock had given way to a raw, burning terror, not for death itself, but for the manner of it. The Calais executioner, the subtle shift in Kingston's gaze when he spoke of him, it gnawed. At her, a venomous whisper of deliberate torment. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a trapped bird desperate for escape. Lady Elizabeth and Lady Mary, her closest attendants, finally approached her, their faces blotchy with weeping. They had been with her through the glorious ascent, seen. The sun shined brightest on her, and now watched as the shadows lengthened and swallowed her whole. Their loyalty, though fragile, remained. They knelt before her, their hands reaching for hers, cold and trembling. "Your Grace," Lady Elizabeth whispered, her voice choked with tears. "We would stay with you to the last." Anne looked at them, their sorrow a mirror to her own. "There is no need," she said, her voice surprisingly strong now, imbued with a strange, fierce resolve. "Go. Go to your families. Save yourselves from this taint. You have seen enough of the king's wrath." She thought of her daughter, Elizabeth, hidden away, safe from this unfolding horror. Would her little girl ever know the truth? Would she ever escape the shadow of her mother's ignominious end? The thought was a fresh stab of pain, but it also fueled her resolve. She would face this with what little dignity remained. But her ladies refused, their quiet insistence a small comfort in the vast ocean of her despair. "We are bound by duty, Your Grace," Lady Mary murmured, her eyes red-rimmed but firm. and by affection. Anne gave a faint, bitter smile. Affection. A rare commodity in these treacherous halls, she accepted their presence, their silent vigils, a testament to a fleeting, fragile humanity amidst the cruelty. The hours dragged. They brought her a simple meal which she barely touched. Every morsel felt like ash in her mouth. She requested a chaplain, a man she had known in better days, a reformist scholar, to hear her final confession. It was a strange irony to seek solace from a faith she had helped to splinter. The chaplain, Father John, arrived, his face pale and drawn. He was a good man, earnest and pious, and his gaze met hers with genuine sorrow, not judgment. He saw the woman, not the political pawn. He heard her confession, a litany of small sins and large regrets, but none of the monstrous betrayals for which she had been condemned. As she knelt, her head bowed, the words felt hollow. What absolution could be found in a world so steeped in calculated destruction? Yet there was a faint easing of the burden, a momentary lightness, as if by speaking her truth, she had reclaimed a tiny piece of herself. After the confession, Father John remained, offering prayers, his voice a low, soothing murmur in the oppressive quiet. Anne listened, her eyes closed, trying to find a foothold in the words, a sliver of hope in the divine. But the earthly horrors overshadowed the promise of the ethereal. She found herself focusing on the clanking of the unseen guards outside, the faint sounds of life from the river, the unrelenting chill that permeated the very stone. As the night deepened, a profound loneliness descended upon her, a chilling realization that in this moment she was utterly, devastatingly alone. The king, her family, her friends, all had either abandoned her, been consumed by the same machine that now held her, or were powerless to intervene. The only company she truly had was the specter of her own impending death. Then, a new sound, distinct from the usual hum of the tower, began to filter into her chamber. A rhythmic thudding, distant at first, then growing steadily louder. It was the sound of hammers, striking wood, building. What could they be building at this hour? A cold knot formed in her stomach. Her initial dread that the execution would be botched now morphed into a new, more specific terror. They were not merely preparing a block, they were constructing a stage, a scaffold perhaps grander than the simple scaffold typically used for minor traitors. A spectacle. The sound intensified with the passing hours, a relentless, mocking rhythm of construction. Every hammer blow was a spike driven into her own coffin. Her ladies, too, heard it, their eyes wide with fear, reflecting the same unspoken question. The very air vibrated with the ominous activity. It wasn't just on Tower Hill, as Kingston had said. It was closer. Too close. Could it be within the tower precincts themselves? But Kingston had clearly stated Tower Hill. Was this another deception? The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through her. If the execution was to be within the tower walls, not on the public hill, then the king's mercy was not just a lie, but a twisted, cruel joke. It would mean a more controlled environment, perhaps, where the skilled executioner could truly demonstrate his art, unhurried by the unpredictable clamor of a public crowd. The idea of being made an example, a horrifying object lesson for the select few witnesses within the tower walls, was a terror she had not fully considered. This was not a private mercy. This was a private horror. She paced the small chamber, her hands twisting her pearl necklace, the beads feeling like frozen tears against her skin. The hammering seemed to be coming from the direction of the tower. Green. The very spot where so many nobles, some innocent, some guilty, had met their end. But never a queen, not like this. A sudden, sharp rap on the door startled her, making her jump. It was Kingston again. He entered, his expression even grimmer than before. "Your Grace," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "The king's final request." Anne's heart pounded. Final request. Another twist of the knife. "What is it?" She asked, her voice barely a whisper. "He desires that you make a public statement, a confession of your sins and his goodness." Kingston looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "Before your death, a public confession of sins she had not committed, of goodness in a man who was orchestrating her brutal murder. It was the ultimate humiliation, the final attempt to blacken her name beyond redemption, to justify his monstrous actions to history. Her rage, a cold, brittle thing until now, flared into a sudden, consuming inferno. "Never!" she hissed, her eyes blazing, the last vestiges of fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by a pure, unadulterated fury. "I will confess to no such lies. I am innocent of these charges, and I will die proclaiming it, if it is the last breath I draw." Kingston sighed, a deep, weary sound. "Your Grace, reconsider. It might ease your passage." The implication of an easier death, a swifter end if she complied, hung in the air. A bargain with the devil. But Anne was past bargaining. She had been betrayed too many times, sacrificed too many pieces of her soul for this king. "Tell him," she said, her voice ringing with newfound clarity, "that Anne Boleyn dies a queen, and no false confession shall stain her name." Her defiance, born of absolute despair, was the only power she had left. Kingston bowed his head, a gesture of defeat. He knew her spirit. He knew the futility of his task. He turned to leave, and the heavy door closed behind him, plunging the chamber back into a silence that was now even more profound, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic hammering. Anne stood in the center of the room, her crimson gown a defiant splash of color against the gray stone. She felt a strange calm descend upon her, a quiet strength born of absolute surrender. They could take her life, but they could not take her truth. She would die as she had lived, fiercely, defiantly, on her own terms, to the very last breath. As the hours bled into one another, the hammering stopped. A new sound emerged, barely audible at first, then growing louder, the murmur of a crowd, a low, expectant hum. It was not the distant roar of Tower Hill. It was too close, too contained. Fear coiled in her stomach again, tightening its icy grip. They were here, within the tower. The mercy of a private execution was indeed a refined cruelty. She moved to the window, pressing her face against the cold bars. The sky was still bruised purple, but now a faint, sickly gray light was beginning to creep across the horizon. Dawn, and with it, a horrifying revelation. Below, on the meticulously manicured expanse of the tower green, a scaffold stood stark against the fading night. It was not a grand, imposing structure for a public spectacle, but a low, compact platform shrouded in black cloth. And standing beside it, silhouetted against the nascent light, was a figure, tall and broad, holding something long and glinting. The executioner, from Calais. And in his hand, not a heavy axe, but a sword, a long, narrow blade that caught, the first faint hint of light reflecting it like a sliver of ice. The silence of the tower green was broken only by the muffled shuffling of a small assembly of guards and what appeared to be a handful of high-ranking officials, hand-picked witnesses to this private horror. It was a macabre, intimate tableau, designed not for the masses, but for the chilling satisfaction of the king and the grim professional precision of the man who held the blade. The thought that her torment would be a private performance, a carefully curated display of vengeance for the king and his inner circle, rather than a messy public affair, filled Anne with a fresh, deeper wave of dread. This was not less painful.